Good afternoon. My name is Justin. I am a professor at Texas Tech University. That is my day job. My night job is that I fight crime. No, I'm just kidding. My night job is that I am a scientific advisor for a marketing company called HCD. What HCD does is we provide biometric and psychophysiological measurement specifically related to marketing, advertising, user experience, and audience segmentation. I run a lab called the Cognition and Emotion Lab at Texas Tech. We mostly do health prevention messaging, so that's kind of what my background is in. I have a PhD in cognitive science and in mass communication from Indiana University, so if you are into Hoosier basketball, we can chat. Other than that, that's about who I am. All right, so for those of you that have no idea where Texas Tech University is, if you were to get in your car, and we're right next to I-30, and it goes east-west, if you headed west for about 6 hours, you would drive through approximately 3 towns, all of them very tiny, and then you would run into Lubbock. And so there are many ways to get to Lubbock, but ultimately you're still going to end up in a town of 250,000 and it's really boring. And so there are lots of ways, though, to escape Lubbock. And trust me, I've escaped Lubbock a lot. I've been in my home for 8 days since May 12th. And I have 4 kids, so a lot of that I had my 4 kids and my wife with me. So one of the problems with marketing research is that we tend to talk about destinations a lot. Well, we know something because they bought this computer. We know something because they went into the dealership and they bought a Prius, right? But what made them actually come to that conclusion? How did we move their attitudes over time to where they leaned towards a more economically friendly car, or maybe they just really wanted a Corvette, right? And so there's many routes where they might end up in the same destination. And so to prove this, there's Lubbock in the far left. It's way up there. We're about an hour and a half away from the New Mexico border. If you've never been to Texas before, Texas is huge. So everything is bigger, or such things. And so you could go what is called the southerly, faster, more boring route to get here. That's how I got here, is I drove my car down and I hit I-20 and I came over east. Or you could go the northernly, slower, but prettier route, where you could go up and it's all these state highways and it's really pretty. You pass by all these really cool ranches, right? But the problem would be if you just asked someone, hey, where are you going? And they said Dallas. That doesn't necessarily tell you how they got there, right? There's this big problem within communication research. So I'm a professor of electronic media, so I talk about communication a ton, right? There's this big problem within communication research where there's this kind of war being waged between factions. It's not quite like some TV show, but it's pretty close. Where there's the people that just care about the effects, and there's the people that care about dynamics and processes. And the effects people say it doesn't matter how they got there, it matters that they changed the channel, or it matters that they cared about the advertising, or it matters that they bought something. And the processes and dynamics people are saying, you're right. It also matters how they made that decision, right? So not just what, but how. And so one of the things that I want to talk about today is that liking and buying behavior and brand attitudes and all these things we tend to talk about within marketing research, those are all destinations, right? Those are effects. The interesting thing is that we've hit a point within technological ability and within cognitive science and within psychological understanding that we can actually begin to understand the processes by which we came to that. And so the problem that I get brought across my email quite a bit is, okay, Justin, we ran this study for this client, and 2 separate people bought the same product, but they had very vastly different reasons for why they bought it. How do we explain that to the client? And so this is why I'm here with you today. Understanding the processes. First, we have to understand that media use, and I'm going to argue that pretty much any time you interact with a brand, a logo, an item, anything like that, that's some kind of mediated interaction. It's mediated by air or by TV or my phone or whatever. Media use is a dynamic interaction over time, so we have the ability to give feedback to our users. They have repeated interactions with us between what I'm going to call the mind and media, and there's a lot of other gobbledygook words on there that don't really mean anything, so don't worry about that. If you have questions, you can talk to me later. Second, media use engages some processes over time that actually lead to the effects. So things activate in your brain that lead you to have emotional reactions, that lead you to have attentional and cognitive reactions that eventually, way over here, might lead to you buying a Bic pen, right? It's a bunch of small stuff, but eventually you buy that pen, right? The third one is that these intervening processes lead over time and in summation to the effect. So the thing that we ask people a lot in surveys is, okay, what did you buy? Right? And they say, well, I bought that thing. Or why did you buy it? Well, I like that thing. Of course, the problem with that is that how many people have children? All right? Okay. If you have children, you are very quick to understand the Christian doctrine of total depravity, right? Even if you're non-religious at all. Right? Because the first time your kid like smashes something on the ground, you're like, who did that? And they're like, wasn't me, dude. Right? Like I have a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 17-month-old. Lies abound in my house. And guess what? They abound in your surveys too. Right? Like we don't necessarily grow out of that. We always, there was a talk yesterday where the dad or the husband is walking through the grocery store. You guys remember this? Where he's walking through the grocery store and he's like, we're planned, man. We don't ever make random purchases. We're so segmented, and literally the wife is going, hey, can we buy this thing? Like, people lie about themselves, okay? And this gets out of that. The body cannot lie about what the brain is doing. The mouth can lie a ton, right? All right, so what we want to do, it's always cool to have animations until you forget to click on them. What we want to do is we want to use an approach that observes this brain activity in real time, and we want to use that brain activity to tell us how and why a message might fail or it might succeed. So there's a lot of things that we could do to metric that data to come out. Today I'm going to literally show you like raw data. And I'm going to show you why it's complicated and why you could use it. So what we do in my lab academically and what I do for HCD is we measure the brain via the body. There's a number of reasons for that, partially because fMRI is crazy expensive, so unless you have like $7 million laying around and you have the money to hire a physicist full-time and an engineer full-time and all that, which if any of you do, talk to me. I'd love to spend your money. But it's way cheaper, like on the order of about $50,000 to set up a psychophysiology lab. And so we measure that. So what can we measure? Well, we can measure cognitive resource allocation. That's going to be a fancy word for attention. Attention is kind of a dirty word within cognitive science because attention is messy and it's muddy, and in science we're reductionists and we like to have this really singular thing, so we call it cognitive resource allocation. So how much effort is the individual putting towards the processing of that thing, whether it's a TV ad, whether it's to work through your app, which apparently they won't download if you're Groupon, apparently. I have the Groupon app. I raised my hand. And so we can measure that. Secondly, we can measure their motivational activation. This kind of takes an approach on emotion that emotion is a central part of human life, and it starts very, very centrally in the brain. If I were to draw an arrow through my nose all the way back and through my ear hole all the way across, where it would intersect is pretty close to my limbic system. And the limbic system is where emotion kind of starts, right? And it takes this idea that that is where all of human behavior and all of that kind of starts with these roots. And so we can measure those. And lastly, we can measure physiological arousal. So people have a valence to their emotion. It's either positive or negative or sometimes both, which is interesting. And they also have an intensity to that reaction. So we can measure all that. How can we measure that? Well, we can measure resource allocation through someone's heart. We specifically typically do it through electrocardiogram, so an EKG. So if you've ever been to the hospital and heard the beeping and saw the stickers, we do that. Don't worry, we don't pull open participants' chests and do all that. We put it on their arms. It's way more docile. I don't feel like getting sued by some undergrad, so I don't do that in my lab. So changes in heart rate over time indicate changes in resource allocation. Specifically, as the heart rate goes down, so as you get a slower heart rate, slower and slower, that means that they are processing an external stimuli more and more, okay? And similarly, increased heart rate could mean one of two things. If you have a really well-controlled experiment, it means that they're not paying attention to your stuff anymore, which is bad. That's not how you get buying behavior. If you have a really naturalistic experiment, let's say that you hooked up some wireless units to them from Biopack or whoever, and they're walking through a grocery store, that probably means that they're doing some internal processing. They're thinking, which beer do I really need tonight? Do I need Heineken or do I need the other one, right? So they're doing some kind of internal processing. So this is what heart rate data looks like. Okay, so this is why this is not easy. So the study I'm going to talk about today is, it's a study where what we were trying to find out is how a headline or a big, bold bit of text on a social media platform, so let's say it's Twitter and you scroll through and you read the headline and then the video starts auto-playing, right? Like if any of you watch the the Trump fiasco of a speech last night. Like you probably saw the headline, like, she ripped off Michelle Obama, and then below it is the video, right? This is kind of what we tried to do, but we tried to do it in a very controlled setting. And so what this is it presented either a gain or a loss frame followed by a positive or a negative message. And all these messages were related to drug behavior. So, you know, a gain message might be, the person in this message stopped doing heroin. That's a good thing. And then in the message, it's really sad about how heroin had ruined their life. So they were crossed so that they either had a gain with a positive or gain with a negative or vice versa. You know, so there were 4 combinations. So this is really messy. You can't really see anything. And when we ran all the stats, my grad students were all depressed because they're grad students, so they were already depressed. But then they were really depressed. And so what I did was I split this out. So what we're looking at here is this is whenever the frame, when the headline matched the valence of the message, right? So if it was a gain frame with a pleasant message or a loss frame with an unpleasant message, this kind of pattern happened where you see at about second 9 or 10, the heart rate speed's way up, right? So they oriented for a little while. They're like, oh, this is cool. Yeah, I want to pay attention to this. And then at some point they're like, and they stopped paying attention. Some of that could be because this population was undergraduate students. And how many of us remember being undergraduate students? Yeah, right? Like I had no attention span. It's amazing that I got a PhD. However, the interesting thing here is this, because this is effectively the combinations that we see a lot on social media. So when you see clickbait, this is what this is, right? It's some kind of lead that makes you want to click, right? So it's some really negative thing, but then the message is positive, and you're like, well, that's awkward. Or it's really positive, and you click on it, and you're like, oh, God, dying dogs. You're like, why, Sarah McLachlan? And so it's that kind of effect, right? Sorry, I just like jokes. So what we have here is a very different picture than here, right? Whenever the valence is matched, their heart rate went way up after about 10 seconds. You just kind of lose them. And they kind of came back towards the end. But how many people have ever seen an anti-drug message? What's the last 5 to 10 seconds? It's all the text of who funded it, right? Like, this message was brought to you by Partnership for a Drug-Free America. Like, they started paying attention because the voice changed, not because it actually mattered. But interestingly, here, they paid more attention over time. So these are change scores. So the 0 is baseline, and then how much change in beats per minute per second over time. So you can see that, especially whenever it was a gain frame followed by an unpleasant, they paid a lot of attention in the middle of the message. Well, guess what's presented in the middle of a PSA? The solution, right? Oh, my life was awful. It was so bad. Guess what? Heroin did that to me, right? Like, then it gives them a solution. So that's heart rate. So what else can we measure? Well, we can also measure motivational activation, or I'm going to loosely call it emotion, okay? So this is based on rat studies. So, and it also ties in with a bunch of amphibian stuff, and guess what? It turns out that we also have the same systems. So it's 2 motivational systems. There's an aversive system. This is to keep you away from bad stuff, right? So if you walked out and you went towards 7th Street and you crossed the street and all of a sudden your brain goes, there's a bus, and then you jump back, that's your aversive system working. It activates very quickly to bad stuff, but it at rest is kind of lower. Right? It kind of stays out of the way until it really needs to, but it's what gets you out of bad situations. The appetitive system is what makes you approach good things. Guess what? At rest, it's a little bit more active. This is why cavemen left the cave, right? Even when there was danger around, they're like, I should go find mates and food, and this is what causes them to leave. What's interesting is that these things are not digital. These systems are very much so analog, and they activate and deactivate in different functions. And what can happen that's really particularly interesting is whenever people are happy and sad at the same time, or they're appetitive and aversive at the same time. And you may be going, what does this look like? Okay, how many of you have ever watched Grey's Anatomy? Don't lie. That's what I thought. All right, and so you're watching Grey's Anatomy and the episode ends and you're like, why did they kill that guy? And you're so sad, and then this happy-go-lucky ad comes on, right? And you're so sad, but then you're like crying, but you're like smiling because the ad is funny, right? That's coactive. Coactivity is also what happens when people feel ambiguous. Well, guess what? The number one bad thing that can happen in marketing is for someone to feel ambiguous about our product, right? That's terrible. So all those things can happen. Well, how can we measure this? Well, one of the places that we measure a lot is called the corrugator muscle. It's literally the thing that makes you frown. I tell my wife she has an overactive corrugator muscle. She frowns at me a lot. And so we can measure it right here. We can also measure the zygomatic muscle, which is, it kind of goes between the side of your lip and your ear hole, if you drew a line kind of right there. And what it does is it literally draws your mouth into a smile. We can measure a bunch of other stuff, but for this study, those are what we measured. And this is corrugator data. So this is just think negativity, right? So when a message was a gain frame with a pleasant, so that the top graph is the matched pairs. So when it's a gain frame with a pleasant message, wasn't a lot of negativity, kind of stayed low. But when it was gain with unpleasant, weirdly, they read it and then the message started and they go, this isn't pleasant at all, right? Like they felt duped, and so then it went up. Same on the bottom. Whenever it was loss pleasant or loss unpleasant, it goes, the loss unpleasant, it kind of started off high because the words made them frown, and then they kind of stay higher, and then eventually weirdly dips out towards the middle. We haven't figured out what message is doing that, but it's probably some specific. This is a repeated measures design, so there are 4 of this. So it's likely that one of them is just screwy and weirdly wasn't actually unpleasant or something. Or it had like a joke in it that was supposed to be unpleasant, but it made people laugh. There's a bunch of things that could go wrong with that. So that's motivational activation. The last thing we can measure, at least traditionally, is physiological arousal, and we do this through skin conductance. So there are a special kind of sweat glands on you, which is really weird and gross to think about, but they're called eccrine sweat glands, or if you're some of the West Texas people that I work, ecrine sweat glands. And eccrine sweat glands exist on your palms, on the bottom of your feet, and in your armpits. And they're not the sweat glands that when you walk outside into the balmy, metroplex heat, where you're just like, oh, this is oppressive. That's not the sweat that we're talking about. They're not thermoregulation. They solely are tied with parasympathetic nervous system activation, which is basically your fight or flight, right? So they activate when things are getting real good or when things are getting real bad, okay? And the way we measure this is put 2 sensors. You can either do it here on the palm, or you could do it sideways, or you could do it on the fingertips, or you could do it on their feet if you're weird, or you could do it in your armpit if you're really weird. And so what we do is we pass a very small voltage. It's 5 microvolts for our system. Some systems pass even less. Some systems play with fire a little bit more and pass a little bit more. And what we do is it's literally we're using your hand like a resistor in an old radio that you might have messed with. And so we're seeing how much of the signal gets from one electrode to the other. Okay? And the more signal that gets across, the more sweat there is, the greater skin conductance response. So some of you might have heard of this as GSR, Galvanic Skin Response. It's kind of a holdover from when they used to make people literally just dip their hands into a big tub of galvanic stuff. We don't do that anymore. That's a good way to electrocute people. So just in general, I don't like to shock my participants. And so this is what skin conductance looks like. So you can see that when things are gain and pleasant, that's the solid blue line. They start off high and it kind of slowly trends down. That's pretty normal for a pleasant message. Unless there's like suddenly like a naked people, it just kind of goes down over time. There's no reason for them to really have a response. It's just getting more and more pleasant, and they're like, cool, this is great. But as things get more and more unpleasant, you might have to make a fight or flight decision, right? So as a gun gets drawn, your brain has to go, is this real or not? I don't know. And that you have to make a decision, right? So that's what we see with the solid red line. It starts off relatively high, it starts going down, and all of a sudden your brain's like, yeah, but this is getting pretty negative, right? And so it starts trending up. The dotted lines are the interesting ones to me, at least. I research when people feel happy and sad at the same time. And so skin conductance is lower, meaning they're having less emotional response when things are conflicting. So the ad that you told your client to buy right after the finale of Grey's Anatomy, that's this super happy, peppy ad, didn't get squat as far as an emotional response. That's bad, right? So that's just an example. Why would this kind of science or this kind of neuroscience matter to a room full of marketing executives and people that have way higher paying jobs than me? Well, first, depth. So kind of if ethnographies is way on the super deep side of qualitative, this is on the super deep side of quantitative. My wife is a qualitative researcher, and I'm a quantitative researcher. Our kids are caught in the middle. And so this approach allows us to really investigate the processes. It's really deep. It's more than what you could ever tell me. You could never tell me, I frowned a little, and then I smiled a little, and then my hands started getting sweaty, right? Like that was like my first date in prom, but that's not something that someone could actually tell you, right? The second thing is differentiation. So what if someone makes the same decision, but versus another person who made the same decision, they had a totally different process for how they got there. I bought a 4Runner because I wanted a Jeep, but I didn't want a Jeep because a Jeep leaks. So I bought a 4Runner. One of my best friends has a 4Runner. You know why he bought a 4Runner? Because it was white. Literally. He went to Toyota and he's like, that car's cool. First off, stupid decision to buy a car. But second off, this would allow us to have some form of differentiation, right? It also allows us some sensitivity. So this embraces the idea that human behavior is dynamic. It's a huge mess, right? Anybody that comes in and tells you, with biometrics, I can tell you exactly why someone bought something, they are crazy. Or they're way smarter than me. And I'm not unintelligent, so that's big brain stuff. But it allows us to tell things by looking at the combination of biology, psychology, and a little bit of sociology. We can start to investigate these different things and really understand them. Knowing what your customers like is not always enough. I say no longer because I like to overstate things. It's not necessarily enough. If your question is appropriate, we can now investigate why and how they might make that decision. And that's honestly the thing that I think I can add to what a lot of you do. So with that being said, that's my conclusion slide. So a couple important things. I consult for HCD. Glenn Kessler is back in the back corner. He's the CEO and president, and he makes all the pretty things happen. Like I said, my day job is that I work with the Cognition and Emotion Lab at Texas Tech. There's all my contact info if you ever need to find me or want to yell at me or tell me I'm wrong. Which is acceptable. Any questions? Which I'm happy to answer.
I'm sure there are. I'll start you off with one, though. So these are non-conscious responses. So your mood going into the lab doesn't affect the outcomes, presumably?
So that's a good question. So one of the things that we do for that is we take baselines before every message. So, because undergrads are perpetually late to everything. So they, at least in my lab, they come running in, they're going, I'm here for your study. Am I too late? And then, you sit them down, you're like, man, you smell like a sty. And then you start hooking them up, and over time, their sweat goes down, their heart rate slows down, all that. So what we do is we take baselines message by message, and we do that as well with our product testing, with our panel. However, we tell our subjects with HCD, hey, get here early, all that kind of stuff. And since we're paying them, they will. The mood coming in is a concern, but it's something you can take care of with statistics, and also their individual differences is a concern, but again, something that you can take out with statistics. So,
right.
Yeah.
How closely can you time sync these kind of measures to specific events that are occurring day and act, so that you can really link the reactions to particular points, as opposed to you're getting a measure, you're seeing it, but kind of world you can't really do it.
Depending on the measure, it can be within milliseconds, all the way up to about 6 seconds. So skin conductance is kind of slow. It responds at about a 4 to 6 second range. And so, someone does that on screen and now everybody's palms are sweaty, right? It's a little bit slower. I like to show that to my grad students by sitting someone in the chair, shutting the door, making them rest, and then I run over to the door and just go, ah, and bang on it really loud, and then it slowly ticks up, right? Heart rate is kind of the same thing. It takes your heart a little bit to start pumping fast. That's why you can go for a run and be like, man, I'm crushing it. This is awesome. I'm going to die. And it's that kind of feeling. Emotion is really fast. The facial EMG stuff is within milliseconds that we can time like it. And we time like our data sync through TTL signals. So everything is very, very precise. It's basically the exact same precision that you would expect from EEG. So the delay is your body, not in the collection.
Yes, and back here.
He's my boss.
Oh.
But, thank you. But just the applications for this include sensory research, so flavor and fragrance testing, any kind of tactile research, measuring how people perceive social network messages and television commercials. So most of the companies that do this focus on media, but it doesn't have to be limited to media. It's a very good tool for sensory research.
It depends on your question. If you're asking a question related to skin conductance, you could get by, if you have like 2 messages, you might want 20 people per message. You could get by, and that's if you wanted to publish it, like in an academic journal. If I wanted to get statistical significance with a multi-level model or some kind of time series analysis or something, you could probably get by with even less because you get so much data. I mean, we reduce it down to per second bends, and so however many seconds that they were viewing the stimuli, that's how much data we get, but we record it at 1,000 hertz. So you can blow up your computer if you really want to. If the more measures you have and the more stimuli you have, the more subjects you have to have. So we design really simple, direct studies, particularly for HCD, so that we can have really small sample sizes with a lot of power. So.
And can I ask one last quick question? I remember, I don't know, 5+ years ago, we used to ship out these helmets and people would put them on. It's very clumsy and costly. Do you foresee a day when there'll be a self-completion approach, where through their smartphones with some kind of attachment?
Yeah. The future of this is something like that. There are a number of people from the Media Lab at MIT and a few other companies, and then we have a product that we're working on that is effectively trying to do this in a wireless, touchless, mass-distributed way through webcams or smartphones. And so, yeah, that's if you care about, if sample size is an issue, we'll distribute it to a webcam, and all of a sudden you can collect 1,000 people in 2 hours. And if data reliability is an issue, then you go back in and you put the wires back on. But there's a number of solutions that are kind of right on the crest that are, every year at the large scientific community meetings that I go to that are related to this kind of stuff that people are starting to talk more and more and more about. So.
Well, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.